SAP is one of the largest software vendors in the world, and it's experienced some of the most marquee ERP failures in recent years. That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For the last 20 years, I've drafted and negotiated a variety of technology-related contracts and focused my practice on litigating those projects when they go sideways in courts across the country. So the first SAP ERP failure I want to talk about is Lidl. Lidl is a chain of supermarkets in Europe. And in 2018, the supermarket chain spent about 7 years and 500 million euros on an SAP project, and then realized that it wasn't able to adapt its business processes to the way that SAP software was configured. And so they decided to opt for heavy customizations to the software that ultimately for Lidl made the software unusable, and it ended up walking away from the SAP implementation. So I think if you're going to look at this with a jaundiced eye and try to learn from Lidl's failure, I mean, what you're seeing really is, and I think this is debatable, but certainly, an ERP project failure primarily due to Lidl's refusal or inability to adapt its core business requirements or core business processes to the way that the SAP standard retail inventory valuation system that it was licensing worked. And there are a lot of factors associated with that, and I think there's a lot of nuance associated with that. But really it is, at its core, a refusal to adapt to the way that software worked. Lidl will tell you, well, we could not adapt our business processes to the way the software worked because it would have put us out of business, or it would have been a fundamental change to the way that we operate our retail environment. And that's all well and good, but I think you've got to take a step back and you've got to say, okay, well, how did you get into this situation, right? You're 7 years in, you're 500 million euro invested into a project, and then you realize that there is a core business requirement that is not addressed in the software, or that the software doesn't work in the way that you need it to. I mean, that is a failure, not so much on SAP's part, to be honest with you. I think that's a failure on Lidl's part. And what lesson do you take away from that as a customer, as a licensee, as a user of ERP software? And I think that you've got to invest a reasonable amount of time in due diligence, and you've got to understand what your current state is. You've got to understand it enough to explain it to the vendor. You need to understand what your future state is going to look like. You have to have done a robust evaluation of that software product via software demos. You want to compare it to competing software projects. You want to go look at how that software works in a production environment through site visits. All of those things need to be done. Lidl may have done some of that, or maybe it didn't do any of it. It's not really evident in the documents that I've looked at, but I think, certainly having an understanding of what your core business requirements are, what the functionality gaps in that software are with respect to those requirements, and have an understanding of how you're going to adapt to the functionality gap is critical to success. You need to make a decision. Can we customize that software in a way that is efficient, cost-effective to meet our needs, or do we need to modify what our business requirement is? And if the answer is, I can't do either one of those, make that decision early on. Don't make it after 7 years and $500 million of investment. The next marquee SAP failure I want to talk about is waste management. This is a 2008 implementation. Waste Management sued SAP for $100 million, claiming that the software was misrepresented and that SAP didn't deliver what was promised during the demonstrations and the sales cycle after a disastrous implementation of the SAP software. And I think this is a relatively rare occurrence. It is something that we will allege in the lawsuits that we litigate. But you've got to understand, we are litigating kind of the worst of the worst, right? We see this on a regular basis, but I do think as a customer, you're not necessarily going to be defrauded outright. And what I mean by that is, you're going to be shown functionality that is maybe on the project plan. You're going to be shown functionality that's coming up. You're going to be shown, all the bells and whistles, and maybe those are not things that you need in your business. And so, where is the line between misrepresentation, fraud, vaporware, and sales puffery? And sometimes it's hard to draw the line, but I do think that the instances of outright fraud that you're going to see on a day-to-day basis as a customer trying to engage a software vendor is probably going to be on the lower end. I think that you're going to see spectacular cases that get litigated that are going to have allegations of fraud. They're going to have allegations of negligent misrepresentation. You're going to have breach of warranty, breach of contract, breach of the duty of good faith and fair dealing. All that's kind of standard, tools in the toolbox for an attorney in this area. But just because they're litigated doesn't necessarily suggest that there's a widespread issue in every instance. And so as you look at this failure, look at the legal documents associated with it, I think the allegations are certainly interesting and instructive. You look at the misrepresentation of the software. SAP, according to Waste Management, allegedly used fake or unrealistic product demonstrations to trick Waste Management into believing the software was a complete out-of-the-box solution, ready for implementation with without the need for a highly customized environment. Waste Management asserts that the software itself was not as far along in the development process as SAP represented. You look at, despite SAP's claims that the software was ready, that it was an out-of-the-box solution, that there were a number of customizations that were required, and in some instances, extensive customizations that were required to meet basic business needs for Waste Management. There was an allegation that there was poor project execution, and then there certainly were a lot of data issues with migrating data from the legacy system to the SAP system. And of course, according to Waste Management, those were all SAP's fault. But I think you look at this a little bit more holistically, a little bit more realistically. There's blame to go around in every one of these failures. You'll see things like employee resistance to change and resistance to training. And so SAP would assert or did assert that the Waste Management users were not adequately trained and that they were resistant to the new system, particularly in connection with financial reporting and billing functionality. And this led, to or contributed to the failure of the implementation project. And how realistic is this? How true is it in this situation? I don't think we will ever know. But I think what's true is that you've got to focus on change management when you're dealing with the implementation of an SAP system. It's just part of the process, and I don't think anybody has ever said we invested too little in time management or change management. Excuse me. You want to invest way more than you think you should in change management to get to the adoption of that new software system. On the other hand, I think you can make a reasonable argument that, look, if this software system is riddled with errors, it's riddled with deficiencies and gaps in functionality, of course people are going to be resistant to change. They're not going to want to adopt a system that does not make sense for the user. And there's some validity to that. But I think you've got to push your people for change management. You've got to push past that resistance, or you're never going to get anywhere. Will you end up in court? Probably not. But it's certainly going to put you on the right foot towards a successful implementation project. The next SAP failure I want to talk about is MillerCoors. And about, I would say, I guess four or so years ago, I think it was in 2018 or so, MillerCoors brought a lawsuit against the integrator of the SAP system, which was HCL Technologies, which was a big Indian-based integrator. And the allegations in that case were that HCL missed deadlines on a consistent basis. There were significant cost overruns. There was inadequate staffing. There was a failure to provide deliverables that conformed with mutually agreed upon specifications. And really, it was just a failure of project management. It was riddled with inexperienced and incompetent consultants on the HCL side. It was not a good implementation partner. HCL countersued, and so here we do see what the specific allegations were, at least in this case. In HCL, again pointed the finger at MillerCoors, saying that their management was dysfunctional. It was a leading contributor to the project's downfall. They did not understand their own business requirements. Business requirements were changing and evolving during the course of the project. And again, this is kind of par for the course in one of these disputes. So the first canary in the coal mine with the MillerCoors lawsuit or project really was, soon after the project began, MillerCoors began to raise concerns about the direction of the project, the quality of the deliverables, and the project scope changes that were resulting because of the low quality of the deliverables. The initial phase went live in 2015. There were significant issues, including what MillerCoors alleged were 8 critical and 47 high severity defects. So again, the system that HCL was implementing was just riddled with defects. And I think, it's fair to say that, the defects were really the result of customizations in deliverables that were specific to MillerCoors that were not necessarily out of the box SAP solutions that would have been ready for delivery to a general commercial customer base. And then one of the other major allegations in the complaint was really MillerCoors asserting that the consultants that were used by HCL didn't have an understanding of the SAP software or MillerCoors specific industry. And I think all of these were contributing factors to the failure of the SAP system. And what are the lessons learned from this? What are the takeaways? And I think really you look at this failure, and again, you've got a scenario where the integrator just wasn't up to par pursuant to the allegations of MillerCoors. And I think that certainly can go both ways. I mean, maybe there was a substantial amount of scope creep. Maybe there was a lack of understanding on MillerCoors' part of its business processes and its business requirements. Perhaps those were changing on a consistent basis. There's got to be a reason why they ended up in this scenario. But I think, the takeaway here is to have, a contractual framework for managing your vendor, for understanding what is going to happen when things go wrong, to have a process in place for when those deliverables do not conform to the specifications. What is going to happen? Are they going to be redelivered? Are they going to be retested? Who's responsible for that? Who pays for that? All of those things can be minimized or mitigated through a contractual process. You've got to negotiate these contracts. You've got to invest the right amount of time in tailoring contracts that anticipate problems that are going to happen. And I think that is a critical lesson from this. I mean, I think if there was a robust contractual framework that laid out the roles and responsibilities and the path forward when things started to go off the rails, maybe there wouldn't have been a lawsuit at all. We will never know. But I think you want to put your best foot forward in these situations, mitigate your risks, have a robust contractual framework put in place so that you give yourself a dog in the fight and you avoid a costly trip to the courthouse. The last SAP failure I want to talk about today is Revlon's 2018 SAP implementation failure. And this was a failure, according to Revlon, due primarily to poor data integration, operational disruptions, a lack of preparation. This all led to a halt in manufacturing and an inability on Revlon's part to fulfill customer orders. This is kind of the death knell here. Some of the worst things that can possibly happen when an ERP project goes sideways. You've got operational disruption, right? The new system caused service level disruptions to Revlon's North Carolina manufacturing facility. You've got an inability on Revlon's part to fulfill its basic orders. The company struggled to track inventory and meet customer demand, which led to a loss of allegedly $64 million in sales. I mean, these are huge numbers. There were substantive data issues. The implementation struggled with data accuracy. It struggled with data integrity. There were integration issues. There were issues associated with financial reporting. Revlon was forced to revise its financial statements, and the project incurred significant write-offs and costs. And I think, again, all of this could have been avoided. you've got to properly invest in project management for one thing, right? You've got to make sure that you are hiring on your side people that have deep experience with SAP implementations. You have to have a robust project management team. You've got to diligently watch deliverables and timelines and milestones. You want to minimize the amount of customizations that you're going to make to that software. And on the front end, you want to have used a robust due diligence process where you have evaluated the software, you've evaluated the particular integrator that you're using, and you want to know, what you're getting yourself into. You have to have reasonable expectations. How do you end up in a situation like this? And I think it's really, poor planning on Revlon's part. And to some extent, I think your integrator and your vendor, are not particularly motivated, to push back on you, right? They're not. They make less money from a well-managed project than they do from a mismanaged project. These are almost always time and materials-based projects, and so I think that's a factor to consider. In addition to inadequate data migration and some of the other problems that we talked about, I think here there really was on Revlon's part a focus on technology first over business processes and business requirements. And I think anytime you lead with a technology first approach, you're doing yourself a disservice. And the likelihood that you're going to have an implementation failure when you haven't fully vetted what your business processes are, it's going to spell trouble for you. You're going to rely on customizations. You're not going to have an understanding of how to deal with functionality gaps. You're going to want to modify that software to deal with issues. And I think all of that really does set you up for failure. If you have any questions about any of the lawsuits that I've discussed in this video, please feel free to reach out to us at taflaw.com. We'd love to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction.